Hello and welcome to the John Ark Show. On today's episode, we're going to interview Fabrizio Poli. He's one of the world's leading experts in the sale, lease, and management of business jets. He's also the host of the BizJet TV channel on YouTube, and he has a company called Kaizen Aerospace that manages and charters aircraft. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to subscribe, like, comment, and follow us. Also, I'd like to tell you about a service called HollywoodIsCalling.com. It's a great service that allows you to purchase live phone calls from your favorite celebrities, so check them out. It's something you can buy for yourself or as a gift for someone you love. So now let's say hello to Fabrizio. Hi, Fabrizio. Welcome to the John Ark Show. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing fine.
How is the flying weather in the UK?
Oh, the weather here is always raining, so rain and windy. But, you get used to it.
All right. So in addition to being the host of a popular business jet channel on YouTube called BizJet TV, you're also one of the leading brokers in the sale, purchase, and maintenance of business jets. However, before we get to any of that, I'd like you to tell us how you got involved in the aviation industry.
Well, my interest in aviation and space started at a very young age. When I was a kid, like 5, 6 years old, fascination with airplanes. By the time I hit the age of 8, I'd lived on 3 different continents. So we're constantly traveling on aircraft for my father's work. He was a senior manager for Vidal Sassoon. So we lived in New York, and we lived in London, and we lived in Milan. So we're constantly moving around. I also went to international school, so I grew up with kids from all over the world. So my interest in aviation grew. Initially, I wanted to be an astronaut. So I wrote to NASA to find out what I needed to do. And there were 2 roads: or you become a scientist or a pilot. So scientist really wasn't up my street. I'm a very action kind of guy. So I thought the pilot thing sounded more like me than sitting in a laboratory all day with test tubes and whatnot. So I went down the pilot route. And then as I got older, I learned to fly when I was 15. I was flying gliders, and then I got my pilot's license when I was 17, and then worked my way up to commercial pilot training, and that qualified both in the UK and in the US. Started flying private jets as a pilot, and as I was doing that, I ended up managing aircraft for owners, selling aircraft. I ended up managing an FBO as well. So I did a lot of stuff around private aviation for 5 years. But my goal at that point, I'd met some astronauts and talked to them. And I was honestly thinking that, by the time I was, a bit older, that we would have been going back to the moon, Mars and beyond. I was born in 1969 when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. And if you had asked me back in my teens where I would be now, where I'm sitting here at 51, I would have said, well, we would probably be out of the solar system by then. We haven't even been back to the moon. So when I spoke to astronauts and found out what they actually did, I found it extremely boring, sitting in a space station orbiting Earth for 6 months. That's not really my idea of fun. I thought, astronauts were going to be going to, other worlds, a bit like Star Trek, Star Wars, that kind of thing. But it hasn't happened, or hasn't happened yet. So I got involved in aviation, very happy in that space, joined the airlines, flew for a number of different airlines for about 13, 14 years, both in the UK, Ireland, and also in the Middle East. And then I got to a point in my life where do I continue this airline pilot career thing, or do I do something different? And because I'd did well with business aviation and selling aircraft and that at a very young age, and saw that the business aviation was going to be growing, I thought, you know what, let's change and go into selling private jets. So I set up a company with a business partner. He was in the States, I was over in the UK. We worked together about 6 years. Then I decided to leave because I wanted to take the company in one direction. He wanted to take it in another. So instead of sitting there disagreeing every 5 minutes, I thought it was probably easier for me to leave. So I went off on my own for a couple of years, brokering flights, brokering leases on jets, and selling some aircraft at the same time. And then it dawned on me that if I really wanted to make it big, I needed to set up a company with a team. And this is where Kaizen Aerospace was formed just 3 months ago. And we are now in the process of buying a series of aerospace companies. We're doing a roll-up, and we're getting these companies working together. We're doing private jet management, private jet charter, maintenance. We're going to get involved in drones, electrical vertical takeoff and landing, and then also stuff going into space. And that's why the company is called Kaizen Aerospace and not aviation. So we set our sights high. The whole coronavirus thing has, made us think bigger and think that, we needed to create something that was, let's say virus protected from the virus and from a business standpoint. I mean, if we were an airline, for example, we'd be suffering right now. But, anybody that's into drone delivery have been making money. And more companies have started to think, if you have a restaurant these days or a chain of restaurants, you want to start thinking about doing drone delivery to your customers. And so a lot of, different businesses are looking into that. So, and also on the private jet front, people that before weren't thinking of flying private. Now, bear in mind, there's a very important number here. Knight Frank Wealth Report came out in April 2020 saying there are 514,000 ultra high net worth individuals in the world, which are people that are worth more than $30 million. Now, out of that number, only 3.5% own a private jet. Now, if you had asked me that question, how many ultra high net worths own a private jet? Off the top of my head, I would have said 25%. When I did the maths, and I was the first one in the industry to do the calculation, 22,000 jets, 514,000 people, that's 3.5%. I was shocked. I thought, I honestly thought that number was going to be higher. But there are a lot of people that, have the money, but up until now we're flying first class or business class. Now they're starting to realize if you get on an airplane with another 249 people, the chances of you catching a virus are very high. And when you go through an airport, the whole process of going through the airport, getting on a plane, getting off on the other end, there are 700 touch points where you could contract a virus compared to about 70 if you're going to get on a private jet. So the chances of getting a virus on commercial airlines is a lot higher. So if you have the money, either charter a jet, lease a jet, or buy a jet. And so a lot more people now have been knocking on the door and inquiring and buying private jets. And so things have really, really changed. And I think we're going to see a big spike in private jet ownership over the next couple of years. A lot will depend also on the US election, on who wins the presidency. If Trump gets confirmed or not. Trump is very pro-business and very pro-private jets. The other party are very against it. And that will have a bit of a knock-on effect on private jet usage throughout the world. But, I see we're coming into a good period for the industry.
So when you say aerospace, are you going to be competing for the same segment that Elon Musk is going after, that Bezos are going after, or are you headed in a different direction?
Well, we're not going to actually be building rockets. We're going to be more probably maybe buying a rocket or two. I mean, I don't know. We'll see. I mean, right now the plan for the business is to do some stuff in the private aviation space, and then we'll move into the space probably in a couple of years' time. But we've got our sights on a few things, and there's a few things being developed. A lot I can't disclose right now. But we're keeping our eye close on that industry because I think there's a big opportunity. I mean, after the successful SpaceX launch with the 2 astronauts, and the next launch is coming up at the end of this month, where they're launching 4 astronauts to the space station, 1 Japanese and 3 Americans. There's going to be so many opportunities in space. And, some people criticize the fact that we're going into space, saying that we should spend the money here on keeping this planet safe, et cetera, et cetera. But, the opportunities of developing technology, discovering new energy and all that kind of thing out there in space and on other planets, it's going to benefit humankind, like the Apollo space program benefited humankind as well.
All right. So let's get into one of the topics that a lot of the public is most interested in, and that is the topic of pricing. Now, I know you don't like to give specific pricing information, but generally speaking, what is a business jet at the low end? What's the pricing spectrum, price range for business jets?
I mean, you can pick up a private jet today for $200,000. The problem is it's going to come with a lot of problems. So, when you're looking at buying a jet, the price is important, but then you always have to remember, and I always tell people this, there are 4 elements to private jet ownership. Number 1 is buying the aircraft. Number 2 is maintaining the aircraft. Number 3 is flying the aircraft. And number 4 is managing the aircraft. So too many people get caught up in the pricing in the jet itself, and they think, I'm getting this jet for cheap. And then they end up paying $400,000 for the jet and then $3 million in maintenance, which nobody told them about. And unfortunately, a lot of people in the industry that sell aircraft, they as soon as a customer comes by with some money, they just sell them whatever they can sell them, and they don't think of the long term. with the client. I mean, my focus has always been on giving people what they need, not what they want. You come to me, you're not going to get what you want. You're going to get what you need. I'll be very frank and open and tell you exactly what you need and why. And then on the management front, things need to be done in a certain way. I mean, not many people know that the safety factor in private aviation is 5 times worse than the airlines. So if you decide to charter a private jet from Los Angeles to New York and you're paying, I don't know, $50,000 for the flight, you have 5 times more chance of dying on that flight than if you were to fly United and pay $1,000. Now, why does this happen? It's just the training, the maintenance. There's so many of these people out there cutting corners with the private jet. And, private jet pilots fly a lot less than the airline pilots. They fly about 250 hours a year. A lot of the training is done like just once a year instead of twice a year or 3 times a year. So in my view, private jet pilots need more training, need different type of training, more specific, tailored to the type of operation. And, at the end of the day, people that buy a private jet, we're talking about the wealthiest people in the world. I mean, there are only 514,000 people in the world that can afford a private jet. So if you're going to spend $10, $15 million on a jet, well, you shouldn't go cheap on the pilot salary and you shouldn't go cheap on the training. And the training should be more than the minimum requirement. And let's face it, if you buy a sports team and you want to win the NBA, how are you going to, you're going to get the best coach. You're going to train your players more than anybody else. You're going to do different type of training. You're going to bring in certain machinery in the gyms and whatnot. You're going to train your players very differently than a high school basketball team would train, because you're in the NBA and you want to win. Well, with private jets, it's the same thing. You shouldn't be training your pilots like British Airways and Lufthansa. They should be trained better because you can afford it and you want to be safe and you want to make sure that you're 5 times safer than the airlines, not 5 times worse.
Right. So speaking of safety, what manufacturing companies do you think put out the safest aircraft, the most reliable aircraft? Do you have 1 or 2 at the top that you favor?
Well, I don't really favor one more than the other, but I'd say this. If we have to name one company, there is a company in Switzerland called Pilatus, and they build the PC-12, which is a single-engine turboprop, and the PC-24, which is a jet, which is the only jet that lands on grass. It's got a cargo door as well. Now, they do a very good job. They only make a certain number a year of these aircraft, but they're very well built, very well maintained. But, John, at the end of the day, you can take an airplane that's very well built, very well maintained, and bring it into an operation, and the pilots fly it badly, maintain it badly, and even if it's the best of airplanes in the world, it will be a piece of junk after a year. And I've seen this in my airline career. And also in the private jet industry, airlines, buy aircraft in mint condition, and then a year later, it's a disaster because it was just maintained and flown badly.
Right.
So, these are aspects which are really, really important. And the interesting thing in private aviation is the people that come to me are not aviation people. They're business people that need the private jet as a business tool. So they have no understanding around this. I was talking to a gentleman the other day, and he's buying an aircraft from the manufacturer, and he thinks that because he's buying the airplane from the manufacturer, it doesn't need a pre-buy inspection. Then he wants to do an interior, and he thinks that if he takes delivery of the airplane in November, that the next day he's going to get a new interior fitted. I don't know who told him this fairy tale, but this is the kind of thing that's going on out there in the market right now. So my advice is always, if you're going to buy a private jet, seek professional advice. And the manufacturer, Gulfstream do a good job, Dassault do a good job, Bombardier do a good job, Cessna. They all do a fairly good job in building these aircrafts that have been certified and whatnot. But, it really is down to how this thing is going to be maintained and flown. There are a couple of airplanes which I recommend no one should ever buy, but I don't want to name them. But privately, I can disclose who they are. But generally, most of the airplanes, if you're looking at long haul aircraft, whether you buy a G550 built by Gulfstream, a Falcon 7X, or a Bombardier Global 6000, they're all very good airplanes. Which one you choose will depend on your type of operation.
So, speaking of safety, once again, are jets statistically safer than propeller-driven planes?
Let's put it this way: most propeller-driven airplanes are flown by non-professional pilots. Okay, so consequently, because their training isn't as professional and as high level, they tend to crash more. When you're getting into the bigger jets, there are a few owners out there that fly their own big private jet, but they're usually smart enough to know that they need a professional pilot sitting next to them. I mean, my very first job was flying a Cessna Citation, and I used to fly with the owner. The owner always had a professional next to them, helping them out and everything. And that's a good way to go. When you go into the smaller aircraft that only require one pilot, these small single engine turboprops or even twin engine turboprops like King Airs and whatever, like King Airs crash a lot. Okay, so someone could say King Airs are really dangerous because they crash a lot. But when you go and look at the investigation and the reports on the accidents, you soon discover that it was flown by some guy that owns a chain of shoe stores, flying around on his own all the time, doesn't do any simulator training, or trains very badly, couldn't care less about having a private pilot sitting next to him. Suddenly something goes wrong, and guess what? It crashes.
By the way, we did some research, and I was surprised to find out that at the commercial level, the commercial pilot level, when they do follow-on or additional training, most of that appears to be done in a simulator. I always thought they would be forced to put time in a plane and do the actual testing in a plane, but that doesn't appear to be really the case, does it?
Well, I mean, first of all, it would be extremely expensive, number one, and number two, it would be extremely dangerous. So, so that's why they don't do it. And also, having spent hundreds and hundreds of hours in simulators in my career as a pilot, the simulators are very, very close to reality. In the simulator, you can do so much. I mean, unless you're doing upset recovery training, which I recommend is done in an airplane, okay? Because you just get the whole feel of the G-force and everything and that.
And for the audience, upset recovery training is what specifically?
Well, if we look at accidents, for example, a lot of accidents happen because the aircraft gets into what's called an unusual attitude. So it may, you may end up in cloud or a situation where the airplane may turn like this or like that. It's in an attitude that's not normal, an unusual attitude. Okay. Now, unfortunately, if you look at, for example, the training syllabus from private pilot to commercial pilot to airline transport pilot that the FAA have issued, or EASA over here in Europe, you'll find that there is no aerobatic training, no spin training, none of that in the syllabus. So because of a number of accidents have happened because of unusual attitude and upset recovery situations that pilots got themselves into, didn't recognize they were in a situation like that, so were unable to get the airplane out of that situation and crashed, or alternatively, they got themselves in that situation but didn't know how to get out of it. They've introduced upset recovery training in simulators and that. But when I did my training, I did spin training, I did aerobatics, I did all this stuff because I just realized that that's something that I personally needed to keep me safe. So this is important. The simulator allows you to simulate all sorts of things at a fraction of the cost of what you would do in an airplane. So that's why simulator training is done. And I recommend everybody do simulators because there's so many things you can simulate. It's unbelievable. For the sake of spending maybe $300 or $350 an hour for a Boeing 737 simulator, you can do a lot of practice in something like that, from engine failures to hydraulic failures to all sorts of landing gear, landing without the landing gear, and all that kind of stuff. You can do in the simulator, and the simulators are just getting better and better and better, and getting very, very close to the real thing. So it's a great, great thing to have.
So let's get back to pricing. If someone, and I understand most business jet owners have professional crews flying their craft for them, but if somebody did want to pursue a commercial jet pilot's license, how much time and how much money are we talking about? Is it a commitment of years, of months?
Well, if you've got the money, and we're talking to do it properly, and underline the word properly, it's going to cost you about $150,000. It will take about 18 months. That's of uninterrupted, completely focused 18 months, because you've got to study all the, and then it depends where you do it. If you do it US-based curriculum with FAA, there isn't much to study from a ground school perspective. If
is that starting from scratch with no flying experience? Or is that a seasoned pilot, a seasoned propeller pilot moving forward? Yeah,
from scratch. No, you've never been in an airplane before. Okay, you start from day one, 18 months, you would qualify. Now, the curriculum of training done here in Europe is a bit more thorough than in the United States, and I'm not trying to knock US training down, but we have to go through 14 written exams to get what's called a frozen airline transport pilot's license, and then you have to do about 250 hours of flight training, which is combined between simulator and aircraft. In America, the focus is more on the flying than on the ground school. And so it's just two different ways of looking at it. But you know, the cost is whether you do it one way or the other, it's about $150,000 to do it properly and do all the proper necessary training to arrive to a certain standard. And then when you get to that standard, you have to maintain that standard. And that requires training every year.
Right. Here's another question our audience would like to know. If you're trained in the United States, American flight rules and regulations, and you want to fly overseas, do you have the skill set it takes to fly into a foreign market, or is that another level of training, another level of rules and regulations?
Well, flying around the world, different countries have different rules. There are some basic rules which apply all over the world. I mean, I've flown all over the place. You know, the training in the US tends to be very, very US centric. So there are extra courses that you can do if you go down the US pilot license thing to give you the knowledge base that you need to be able to go to fly to India or South Africa or wherever it may be. In Europe, what tends to happen is when you do your 14 subjects, it covers everything around the globe. So when you've taken all those written tests, you know how to operate all over the world. While in America, it tends to be, well, if you need it, you'll do it. If you don't need it, you can qualify without, kind of thing.
So with regards to the marketplace itself, what is a larger section of the marketplace? Is it the used jet market or the new jet market?
It's the used. I mean, you know, there's plenty of used airplanes out there. And of course, new, by the time you order and you take delivery, sometimes it's like 2 years, sometimes 3 years. Well, if you want a pre-owned aircraft, you could get one, you know, within 3 to 4 weeks if all the paperwork and everything is agreed upon very quickly. Usually a transaction on a private jet takes about 2 to 3 months, just because, you know, the LOI is presented, they don't agree on the price, that goes back and forth for about 2 weeks. Then they do the pre-buy inspection, they find some problems, and then they have to agree who's going to pay for that, and that takes another few more weeks. So in the end, it takes about 2 to 3 months to do a transaction. But you know, certainly there's more pre-owned than used sold per year.
So earlier you mentioned the maintenance requirements for jets, and I heard a few years back that a lot of the commercial airliners were sending their planes to South America to have them maintained because the maintenance costs were significantly lower in South America than in the United States. Where do domestic business jet owners typically maintain their planes? Do they maintain them in the United States, or do they send them offshore to be maintained? What is your experience?
All over the world.
Okay.
All over the world. I mean, the problem right now, because of the lockdown and the virus thing, a lot of people that were waiting to do maintenance have said, you know what, I can't actually fly my jet anywhere, so I'm going to do the new interior now. I'm going to have this upgrade done now, whatever. So what's happened is a lot of the maintenance facilities are fully booked. And so your local one down the road in LA, for example, is fully booked until, I don't know, September next year. So now a lot of people are finding themselves having to go elsewhere and sometimes having to take their airplane overseas to get the work done. I would be always very careful wherever you have your maintenance done, and make sure that, you know, they're going to do a good job, and probably have one of your people on the ground monitoring the situation to make sure it's done and it's done properly.
What is the calculation most people should do when they're deciding whether to purchase a jet outright or to acquire it through fractional jet ownership?
Well, I mean, there's a number of formulas out there. One of the ones we're doing at Kaizen Aerospace, for example, is the operational lease, where you would lease the airplane for 12 months. You need to, you know, in the agreement, you have to use the airplane at least 40 hours a month. So that's minimum guaranteed hours that have to be paid. The beauty of that is that the airplane is available for you and you only, exclusively, for 12 months. Then there's the fractional model, where you would share the airplane with another party or a series of people. I mean, NetJets is the most famous company. You've got FlexJet, which do a similar model to NetJets, where you can buy 1/16 of a jet, or 1/8 or 1/4 of a jet, depending on what you need. Usually the sweet spot for it, if you're chartering and you're doing, you know, 30, 40 hours a year, charter's the way to go. A lot will depend what you're doing with the airplane. I mean, as I always tell people, the power of the private jet lies in the fact that it's available 24/7. Many people come into this industry buying a jet thinking, you know, with a low-cost airline model, which is completely wrong. I mean, in the airline world, the airplanes are there to make money flying passengers. In the private jet world, the airplane does not make money by flying passengers. It makes money by helping the business people do deals, and do deals quickly. And you would do a deal by flying in the airplane yourself, but you also can do a deal by sending the plane out to pick someone up and bring them to see you. And that's how some people very strategically use their airplane. And I think it's a very clever way of doing it, because let's face it, if you're negotiating a big business deal, and now with all the virus thing that's happened, and you're in need now of, in order to close the deal, of having a face-to-face meeting. And the guy you're dealing with turns around and says, John, I'm going to send my jet to pick you up and bring you into New York for lunch. And by the way, if you want to bring your wife and kids with you, you're more than welcome. The jet will be at so-and-so airport tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock to pick you up. And by the way, you can drive your car up to the jet. By the time you get to New York, I'm not going to say the deal's done, but, how many people are going to send out a jet to pick someone up? I mean, Grant Cardone tells the famous story about how he met Damon John from Shark Tank. And he'd been talking to his agent, and the agent said, oh, yeah, Damon's in Miami, and he's trying to get a flight out to Las Vegas, but we haven't found one yet. And Grant turned around and said, oh, no problem. I'm going to Vegas tomorrow morning. I'll give him a lift on my Gulfstream. Now, he wasn't actually going to Las Vegas, but he said, I'll take the opportunity to meet Damon, and I'll just ring around and get some business appointments in Las Vegas. So I'm not just going there to give Damon the lift, but I'll do some deals while I'm there. And he got to fly with him, and then consequently out of that, do a series of deals with him. And he said, if I hadn't had my own Gulfstream G550, I could have never, offered Damon John a lift with my private jet. And that went down very well and allowed him to do a series of business deals.
Sure. So in the used car market, there are vehicles which lose their value very quickly. And then there are older antique vehicles which appreciate in value. Now, in the old plane market, older plane markets, are there used jets which depreciate more slowly than others? Is that a factor in the used jet industry when people calculate their decision making?
Well, first of all, airplanes depreciate all the time. So if you're thinking of, there have been times in the market where they've gone the other way. And that was back in 2006, 2007, where I know of a guy that bought an airplane, flew it for 3 years, and then sold it and made $10 million profit. But, don't think that's going to happen again, because it's not. I mean, chances are your airplane will depreciate. I'm curious,
what was the factor that allowed him to turn that profit on that specific plane? Was there anything that he did?
No. It was just people were paying stupid prices for airplanes. There was so much money around. They were printing money like coming out of your ears. And because there was so much money that had been printed out there by the Federal Reserve, people were saying, this plane at 20 million, we'll sell it for 22. Oh, we'll sell it for 23. And people were just, okay, I'll pay 23 for it. And it was going really bonkers, the whole market. It was ridiculous. In fact, then what happened in 2008 when the Lehman Brothers went under, the prices of a lot of the jets went down by 50% overnight. So if you paid $30 million for an airplane, now it's worth 15 the next day. So it was just, the market was fake. It was just propped up in an unrealistic fashion, and then it went zoom. But most of the time, you're buying an asset that is depreciating all the time. There are some aircraft that depreciate less than others. Obviously, if you're buying new, depreciation is going to be a lot faster than if you're buying a pre-owned aircraft. But the advantage of new, in particular United States, Donald Trump passed a law which allows you to offset, taxes and stuff like that, even on the depreciation of the aircraft, as well as the usage. So as long as that law stays in force, there are certain tax advantages if you're buying a brand new airplane. If you've got suddenly a $50 million tax bill, you can spend it on the jet. And then that jet will depreciate by $6-7 million in year one. You can write that off.
That's Cardone's story. We're going to ask you about that later.
Yeah. So it depends on, and again, depends where you live. If you live in an environment and you're going to register the airplane in a business jet friendly environment, then buying new makes sense, because even if it's going to depreciate more than an older airplane, you get the benefit of the new airplane, you get the benefit of talking to the manufacturer and having the lovely blue seats with flowers on it that your wife wants, for example, and all that kind of fancy stuff that you don't get when you buy a pre-owned aircraft. And then you get about 5 years maintenance included in the price, and pilot training and all sorts of other stuff. So there are benefits from buying new, but it will really depend on what tax jurisdiction you're in.
By the way, earlier you mentioned Grant Cardone, and we were going to get to that, but I'll do it now because it's a very interesting story. Grant's got a famous video up online where he talks about having an enormous $50 million tax bill coming up. And rather than pay that liability, rather than send that check to the IRS, Grant decided to purchase a $50 million jet and use it as a write-off. How often is that tax calculation a part of people's decision whether or not to purchase a jet made? How often does that factor into the making of that decision?
Yeah, very often, in particular in the United States, because you've got, a government that's pro-business jet. I mean, Donald Trump has been operating private jets and helicopters for a very, very long time. He understands it's a business tool. And this is the main thing that, the media do a very bad job when they talk about private jets, because it's all about luxury. It's not about luxury. I'm sorry. And I don't care what political affiliation you're in or whatever. The private jet is a business tool. It saves you stacks of time. And, and including the former British Prime Minister, Tony Blair. And I was on a documentary about Tony Blair a few years ago, and they were asking me about his usage of private jets. Well, he was very anti-private jet until he became a businessman. And because he goes to certain parts of the world, and I know this for a fact because a friend of mine flew him around for about a year, and I know the places that he went, if he didn't have a private jet, there's no way could he go into certain parts of Africa in the morning, do a meeting, and then out in the afternoon. And so it's very, very convenient for that. You get in and out quick. It keeps you safe. It's just you on the airplane or you and your people. There's nobody on there that you don't know. You can have the airplane disinfected. So it's like free from viruses. Add that to it now, which has come into the equation. And so, it's extremely valuable business tool.
So as we researched your industry and your company, we came across a sort of sub-niche of the industry, which is the purchase and acquisition of older military jet fighters. And, we're seeing Russian MiG-29 jets out there for $4.5 million and an assortment of other vehicles, some of them incredibly beautiful and well-maintained and restored. Can somebody who has a business jet license, does that mean they're also equipped to fly a military jet? And the reason I asked that, because I was speaking to one owner of a MiG, and he said that you really have to know what you're doing when you fly a MiG, because if you don't, you can easily detach a retina due to the extraordinary speed and maneuverability of that vehicle. So if you have a pilot's license in commercial jets, does that automatically qualify you for military jets if you decide to purchase one? Or is that a new skill set, a new licensing requirement that's needed?
No, so what we have to understand here, there's licensing and then there's type ratings. Now, the licensing, there's four types of license. There's a student pilot's license, there's a private pilot's license, which allows you to fly, but not for hire. There's the commercial pilot's license, which allows you to fly and be paid to fly people. And then there's the airline transport pilot's license, which allows you to be a captain on an airliner. Now, that's the licensing side. Then there's the type rating. The type rating is you have to have a type rating for every single airplane you fly. So I'm qualified to fly Boeing 737s. I went through what's called an initial type rating on the aircraft, which lasts about 30-day training. There's ground school and simulator and everything. And then there's a certain element that's done in the aircraft. And then you are qualified to fly the airplane as a captain or as a first officer, depending on the type of qualification. For that particular airplane. If I, who am flying 737s, want to go and fly an Airbus A320 or a Gulfstream G550, I have to go and get a type rating for that airplane. So if I decide to buy a MiG-29, I need to go and get a type rating on a MiG-29. That means finding a simulator that I can go to that's approved by the Civil Aviation Authority, which have issued my license, go and do the simulator training, do some training in the aircraft, and then take an exam to be able to fly that airplane. So now these fighter jets are they're high performance aircraft, and they require a lot of training prior to getting into that kind of aircraft. And then it requires a certain type of training to maintain your proficiency in that type of airplane. I mean, the guy that had his retina come off obviously didn't know what he was doing, okay? Now, a lot of these people that go out and buy these aircraft as enthusiasts end up killing themselves. And so, they're very high performance. You have to know what you're doing. I have one of my former bosses, he has a P-51 Mustang. he never flies that thing on his own. He always has a pilot, which is a specialist in the P-51, fly with him. And that is a smart way of doing it. But, you know, they may be just $4.5 million to buy, but those things are very expensive to maintain. And, you know, you have to keep flying them. You can't keep an airplane in the hangar for 6 weeks. You've got to keep flying it. Those machines are built to fly, not built to sit in a hangar.
Either way, and this may be outside your purview, but some of these used military jets are capable of supersonic flight. Is that an entirely different skill set which requires special training, or is that something that most business jet pilots can do?
No, I mean, any pilot can fly. I'm not saying any pilot can fly one of these fast jets. I mean, you have to go through the training and pass the training. So if you're going to buy a supersonic jet, part of the training will be going supersonic. But, you know, at the end of the day, as I said in the very beginning, private jets are business tools. I mean, if you're going to buy a MiG-29, you're not going to fly that around for business. I mean, it's just going to be pleasure. It's just going to be like adding that to your collection of aircraft. But the thing is, if you do buy something like that, you've got to fly it often enough and to a certain level, because you could end up killing yourself. And that's what, unfortunately, most people do. But there is a market for these airplanes for private air forces. And there are private air forces out there that do, you know, special operation stuff in certain countries. You can hire a private air force to go and bomb someone or do whatever you want to do. And so there is a market, and this market has been growing over the last 10 years. I mean, today you can go out and buy a bunch of F-18s, for example, in the pre-owned market, and, you know, operate those things as private airplanes and fly them into certain locations in the world where they need some support, and they'll hire a private army or private air force to help them to fight their wars.
Do you think people, business people, as well as aviation enthusiasts, purchase these military jets out of their love of the aircraft, or do these planes appreciate in price over time? Is that a phenomenon? Is there price appreciation in the used military aircraft space?
No, I mean, yeah, you can buy a Spitfire, and there's, I think, only 2 of the original Spitfires that are still flying. They are worth quite a bit of money, but they do cost a lot of money to maintain. And then you've got to fly these things. And as I said, when you buy these aircraft, you need to fly them constantly. You can't just buy it and sit it in the hangar for 6 months. You've got to fly it every week, go up flying. And it costs money to maintain these things. Also, because a lot of these older vintage airplanes, it's difficult to find the spare parts. And so you've constantly got to, you know, it's a tedious exercise. A lot of people do it for ego. Some do it because they're passionate about older aircraft and they like to collect them. Everybody has their reasons. But, you know, if you do go down that route, just make sure that, you know, that thing flies often, because otherwise you could get yourself into a dangerous situation.
So as we research the aircraft market, we see that there's a good number of planes being sold offshore as well. Is that a comfortable and safe proposition, buying a plane from a foreign country, or is that a little more challenging?
No, I mean, it depends where you're buying it from. But, you know, as I was talking to Martin, our chief engineer, the other day, he was telling me about, he found a bird's nest in an engine once during a pre-buy inspection. And I immediately thought he'd probably been down to someplace in Africa, wherever, to do this. No, this was in Europe. This was in France, actually. So, you know, you can find some really bad aircraft in the United States. So I would say, you know, even buying in the United States can be extremely dangerous. It depends where you're buying the airplane from. I mean, there's certain countries where I would say be careful. But, you know, the one thing that I'd underline, which is really important, is a pre-buy inspection. Have a pre-buy inspection done. It's very important. And sometimes from the maintenance records, you can tell how the airplane's been flown, and that it gives you a good idea of what you're going to find when you actually go and do a visual inspection. But, you know, you need to hire a well-trained and competent engineer to do the pre-buy inspection, and they will write a full report on the airplane and say, yeah, this plane is in good condition, or this plane is missing that. It needs this work done, or you've got a job coming up in 3 months' time, which is going to cost $400,000. That report is sent to the lawyer that's doing the legal side of the deal, and that is sent over to the owner or the purchaser and say, okay, yeah, you're paying $20 million for the airplane, but you've agreed on the price, but there's actually $400,000 of work that needs going into it because it's got corrosion or whatever it may be. And then during the negotiations, they will have to decide who's going to pay for that and who's going to have that work done. But those are things that crop up in a pre-buy inspection. And so if you are buying from the manufacturer, and I'll say this because this guy I spoke to the other day, I hope he is understood, that, you know, even if you're buying from the manufacturer, still have a pre-buy inspection, because some of the manufacturers can be a bit naughty and they just want to get rid of the airplane. What you have to bear in mind is if a manufacturer has one of their aircraft that is pre-owned for sale, there's a bit of an alarm bell, because what's happened there is that they've basically taken the older airplane in and giving the guy a new airplane. Okay, so it's like part exchange, like you do with a car. And sometimes they don't maintain these older aircraft, because bear in mind that manufacturers always want to sell new airplanes. So just be a bit careful and make sure you have that pre-buy inspection done carefully.
So the government has been mandating that plane owners update their avionics to the new standard. And I know that's being mandated for business jets. Can you give us a sense for, by the way, is that also being mandated for propeller planes or just business jets?
No, all airplanes that fly in certain airspace have to have the ADS-B. This is what you're talking about.
Right.
And so, yeah, the cost varies, but you've also got to find a maintenance facility that has a slot. You can get your airplane in there to have the work done. It's just because the whole system of air traffic around the world is changing. What they're trying to do now is they've developed a system where you get a lot of your clearances through, let's call it like text messaging, like on your phone. So instead of actually talking to the controller and getting in and speaking to them, a lot of this is automated, and it's like run by AI. You get your instructions through on a screen inside the airplane. It tells you descend to 5,000 feet, and you reply. And that, well, before everything was done via radio. Now, this is very, very useful when you're doing like transoceanic flights and that, where you used to use HF radio, which is a bit of a nightmare. I mean, I used to fly over the Indian Ocean a lot and at night. And, getting hold of Bombay, the guys over at Bombay Radio was always a bit of a challenge, because the HF is kind of all over the place. Sometimes they hear you, sometimes they don't. You have to give them a position report, et cetera, et cetera. So by introducing these new systems with new technology, it's done via messaging, basically.
So you did a very interesting video recently on a growing problem in the business jet industry, and that is the theft of business jets. I think predominantly you said overseas. And the theft, a lot of the theft is being done by drug cartels who will use these planes as disposable one-flight planes to ship drugs with. Can you tell us about that?
Well, now bear in mind that the market for aircraft have been stolen. They've been stolen all the time. This is not a new phenomenon. It's just been in the news lately because some of them crashed, and so people hear about it. But aircraft are being stolen all the time. Now then, unlike cars, where cars are stolen and then resold, planes are not stolen to be resold. They are stolen to then be used as a tool, again, as a business tool. You get a lot of more theft happen in certain countries, like down in South America or Africa, wherever you get a lot. I mean, the company I was doing business with a few years ago, they had these DC-9s. They were flying around and they flew into Libya. And the pilots went to the hotel. Next morning, they went back to the airport to do their flight, and the airplane had vanished, disappeared completely, never found it. So planes are being stolen. And if you are flying your private jet into certain locations, you want to make sure you've got security and that airplane is guarded at all times. You don't want to have a surprise that someone has stolen your airplane, because that does happen.
Is that also a significant problem in major markets like the US or the UK?
It does happen in the US and the UK as well, maybe on the smaller ones than the bigger ones. I mean, we even saw that happen at Seattle Airport a couple of years ago, where a baggage handler stole a Dash 8, took off, performed aerobatics, and then crashed and died. Right. Now, I'm not sure what the real story is there, because the type of aerobatics he was doing does require a lot of skill and training. Yeah. So I don't think that airplane was being flown by a baggage handler. Or if he was a baggage handler, he was a very well-trained pilot. But anyway, he still, miraculously managed to taxi the airplane and take off, and they just let him get away with it. So again, an airport like Seattle, which is a big international airport, for that to happen. So if you see an airplane being stolen at Seattle, I mean, it's easier to steal an airplane in an outback airfield in Argentina. Yeah,
the Seattle story always sounded to me more like a cover story than the truth. So who knows what went on there. So let me ask you, can a private jet owner outfit their plane with some kind of alarm or satellite tracking system so that if the plane is stolen, they can track it down regardless of where it is on Earth?
Yeah. They're all, especially all the modern ones, they have all those kind of radars on there. I mean, it's very, even if you think of the disappearance of the Malaysian Boeing 777 that happened a few years ago. I mean, we're not in the times of Amelia Earhart, okay, where airplanes would disappear. And with the amount of radar systems that we have today and the satellites orbiting the planet, monitoring everybody and everything that we say and do, and they can even see, you know, what time it is on our watch, kind of thing. They're that precise. You know, you can track airplanes and that if you really want to. Let's put it that way.
Is there a market, a large market for business helicopters, or is that a niche of a niche of a niche?
No, there is a market for helicopters. I'm not a great fan of helicopters, and because I think the design is flawed. You know, this propeller at the back and the one at the front. In fact, quite a few have crashed. And in fact, a good friend of mine died in a helicopter crash a couple of years ago. You probably saw it on the news. The Leicester City Football Club. The helicopter came out and then went into failure, auto rotation, then crashed in the car park, and everybody died. My two friends were flying the helicopter. One of the pins that connects the back rotor to the front came loose, and that's what caused the failure. And unfortunately, everyone died on board. Now we are seeing the electrical vertical takeoff and landing vehicles being developed, and the design on those things is very different. And some of them have 12 propeller engines, like a circle with 12 engines. If 2 or 3 of those fail, this thing is still going to be able to land safely. So I think, you know, and there are manufacturers like Bell, which make helicopters, that are now starting to build these electrical vertical takeoff. So they're realizing that the helicopter, as we know it today, is a dying machine, and it's going to be replaced by these electrical vertical takeoff and landing, which not only do they not make the noise that helicopters make, they're also a lot cheaper to operate, because helicopters are very expensive machines, and also, in my view, a bit dangerous.
Well,
that's my view.
President Donald Trump, years ago, he had a helicopter that went down with his staff and killed staff members. So, you know, this is a common story.
Yeah.
What have the recent health concerns worldwide done to the plane market? What impact have they had on it?
Well, airlines have been really, it's devastating for the airlines. I mean, it's going to take them a good 4 or 5 years to recover. I've got lots of friends of mine that were still doing the airline pilot career thing, flying in the Middle East, making good money. Now suddenly without a job. These guys are in their 50s. They have 15,000 hours as pilots, and they don't know where to go now. Now, some of these pilots will transition into the private jet industry, even though a lot of these airline pilots won't fit the private jet industry. It's a bit like taking a truck driver or a bus driver and trying to put them into a chauffeur-driven Mercedes. It's a different type of job. The guy that drives the Mercedes with the white gloves, you need a different type of personality to do that job compared to driving a bus or a truck. And that's the same thing with going from airlines to private jets. Not everybody is going to fit into that role. I would say probably 90% of the airline pilots will not fit into that role. So the airline industry has been hit big time. Private jets, no. I mean, we see today there's about 10.5% of the private jets that are out there are actually for sale. And that is a normal figure. We're always around about 9.5 to 11% every year. So it hasn't affected the private jet market. Now, some airplanes are selling quicker than others. Transactions have been slower simply because you can't go anywhere. I mean, I've got 4 people right now up on my board that are in the process of buying an aircraft, but the deals are going through very slowly because they're just basically saying, well, if I have the jet delivered tomorrow morning, well, can I have it delivered tomorrow morning? Because that's the next issue. Can we physically go over and get the airplane and then deliver it? And even if we do deliver it, where are you going to go? I mean, so, you know, there are limitations. Many places like Singapore, you want to go into Singapore, you can fly into Singapore, but then you've got to go into quarantine for 2 weeks. Now, the main reason people use private jets is they want to go in and out quick. Well, if you're going in quick, when you get there, you have to sit somewhere for 2 weeks before you can do anything. And then maybe when you get home, you've got another 2 weeks quarantine. So that has kind of flattened the market a little bit. But at the same time, these people, the famous 514,000 ultra high net worth individuals, those that don't have a private jet started to think, you know, when this whole virus thing finishes, I'm going to travel by private jet. I'm not going to do the airline thing anymore. So what's going to happen? A lot of people have discovered Zoom. and they discovered that you can do a lot of deals on video conference. So this is my prediction. The private jet owner that's usually flying 500 hours a year is not going to fly 500 hours a year anymore, because he's now discovered he can do a lot of deals using technology. So he's going to fly 250 hours a year. Now, does that mean there's going to be less private jets flying? No, because the next thing's going to happen. The guy that was flying 500 hours a year, first class and business class, with Lufthansa and British Airways and American Airlines, whatever, has now bought himself a private jet. And now he's going to be flying 250 hours, but on a private jet. So if you take those two stories and you put them into the statistics and you run everything, and I'm just playing the game of, let's say I'm the algorithm, my algorithm says that the private jet market is going to start growing by 5 to 10%.
You've done, actually, we've seen some videos out there on the development of a new supersonic Air Force One for the United States. What's your sense for how far out that reality is? How many years out before you think that a plane like that is actually brought into use?
Well, if Mr. Trump remains the president of the United States, I think we could see that flying inside 5 to 6 years. The problem with supersonic, civilian supersonic, is that over the United States, you can't fly supersonic in a civilian aircraft. And that's always been the case, which is why Concorde didn't do as well as it could have done. Okay. Now, since Mr. Trump has been in office, he has, relaxed some of those rules, and we are moving towards that being changed. But also today, with bear in mind that Concorde is a design from the 1960s, and technology has changed. So I think we're going to see that, and I think we do need to see that. I think if you look at computers and you look at everything in our lives, okay, over the last 50 years has accelerated, except for air travel. We are still traveling at the same speed we were traveling 50 years ago. When I was born, 747s were operating in 1969. We are still flying 747s at the same speed we were flying 50 years ago. So we need to go supersonic, hypersonic, and maybe even faster than that. Okay, I think that's the future. Elon Musk, and a lot of people don't know this about Elon Musk, he's going on about going to Mars and SpaceX. But what people don't realize is that one of his projects is to use his rockets to fly people from anywhere to anywhere in less than an hour on this planet. So what does this mean? He's looking at having probably 20 to 30 cities around the world kitted out with a rocket launch pad. Okay, he's going to launch 1,000 people from Los Angeles to Shanghai, and it's going to take 35 minutes to get there. This will start with cargo, and then it'll go into passengers. Now, not everybody will be able to pass a medical to go and fly on a rocket, because obviously with the G-force and everything, people with heart problems won't be able to travel on those, so they'll be traveling by airplanes, supersonic airplane. A rocket can fly a lot faster than an airplane. We're talking 25 times the speed of sound, things like that. So this thing will go up and down, and it'll take you 35 minutes to get somewhere, which usually takes 15 hours. And then it'll be able to fly back again. And because they'll be able to use this rocket more than once a day, bearing in mind most rockets are used maybe once a year. So the cost of building the rocket, can be amortized over, 100 flights a year instead of over 2 flights a year. And so that brings the cost of operating a rocket right down, which will bring the seat costs down. And so that's something that we're seeing. But, certainly I understand why the US government would want the president to fly on a supersonic airplane, because it just saves stacks of time. And, and time is valuable.
Of all the aircraft I've ever seen in person throughout the world, the most beautiful aircraft I have ever seen up close is the SR71 Blackbird. Mm-hmm. It's a spy plane from, back in the 60s and 70s. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've ever seen one or not, but they have one on display at the Smithsonian Aerospace Museum, on the East Coast. And if you're ever in the U.S. and if these things interest you, it is an amazing airplane.
Yeah, I've seen those airplanes. I've been to many of the museums around the world, including the famous Boeing Museum in Seattle. That was a very interesting visit. In fact, the thing that struck me the most when I paid that visit was the display of aircraft that were manufactured during World War II. Mm-hmm. And it talked about Operation Paperclip and a lot of technology coming from Germany over to the US and whatnot. And I was with a friend of mine, and I pointed out, I said, look, there's one shelf for American airplanes, one shelf for British airplanes, but there's like one shelf for Japanese airplanes and like 5 shelves for German airplanes. I said, now look at the German airplanes. Look how many different airplanes there are, and look at the different shapes. What does that tell you? That tells you that the Germans were way ahead of everybody else technologically. How on earth did they lose the Second World War?
Yeah.
Question.
Well, not just the planes, but the engineering of German planes was decades ahead of the rest of the world at that time. Just amazing. So before we wrap things up, is there anything you would like to promote?
Well, as I said, my new company, Kaizen Aerospace, we're currently, selling, leasing, chartering private jets. Anybody needs consultancy on that can contact us at kaizenaerospace.com, fill in the form, and we can arrange a conversation. And, as I say, I can only give general information out via my channel, BizJet TV, or via this medium. If you are looking at buying a private jet, we really need to understand what your needs are, what business are you in, where do you need to go, how do you think you're going to be using this jet, how many people are traveling, what type of business are you in? I mean, is it just engineers you're going to be flying back and forth, so maybe we don't need a fancy interior? Or are you one of these people that really needs to impress, so we need, flashy looking airplane with a really fancy interior? All these things are really important for us to be able to point you in the right direction as far as jet ownership, which is why, I never compare one jet to another, because as I always say, it depends who's asking the question. And that's where, to be specific, we need to get one-to-one to really understand. Because, at the end of the day, this is an expense, it's a lot of money to invest in a private jet. And unlike a car or a house, this thing is going up at 45,000 feet with you, your family, or your business associates in. You need to make sure you buy the right plane. You need to make sure that that plane stays safe.
Well, listen, it's been a real pleasure having you on the John Ark Show. I have loved aviation as a child, ever since I was a child, when I first started watching the original Star Trek series with Captain Kirk. And I met William Shatner years later, and we talked endlessly about, all the effect he's had on the aviation industry and all the people who grew to love it based on his show. So,
well, that's why I'm here. That's why I got into aviation. I mean, I'm a big Star Trek fan, and also the other show was a $6 Million Man. Yeah. Those two shows were the things that planted that seed in my mind at a very early age.
So I want to wish you the best of luck with all your projects, and you are always welcome back on the show, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, John.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.